If something feels wrong, it already is. The rain tapped relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop sliding down like a warning I couldn't quite translate, and I stood there in heels that pinched my toes, balancing a silver tray that suddenly felt too heavy for my shaking hands, because the room was too quiet, not the soft, expensive quiet of wealth, but the kind that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. Not in the VIP section where men in tailored suits spoke in low voices and never looked directly at each other unless they meant something by it. But the manager had pointed, and I had nodded, because saying no wasn't part of my job, so I stepped closer, eyes down, pretending not to notice how every movement in the room felt calculated, like pieces on a chessboard waiting for the first move. And that's when I saw him, Adrian Volkov, sitting at the center without trying to be, still, controlled. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to own the room. His presence did it for him. And I told myself not to look, not to get involved. Just set the drinks down and leave. But something caught my attention, a glass untouched, fingers tapping once against the table, a glance exchanged too quickly to be casual, and my pulse stuttered, because I had seen this before. Not like this, not this level, but enough to recognize the shape of something breaking before it actually did, and I hesitated. Just for a second, long enough to notice the man 2 seats down shifting his weight in a way that didn't match the conversation, long enough to feel the air tighten like a held breath, and I realized I had a choice: walk away and pretend I saw nothing, or stay and risk being part of something I didn't understand. And I should have left. I should have turned around and disappeared into the kitchen where everything made sense again. But my feet didn't move, because Adrian didn't see it. He didn't see the shift, the silent signal, the moment before everything changed, and something inside me refused to let that happen. So I stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of expensive cologne, close enough to feel the gravity of him, and I leaned in just enough for my voice to reach him and no one else, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I whispered, "Don't move." And for a split second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, because he listened. He did not move, not even a fraction. And that was the moment I realized I had just stepped into something I could not step out of, because men like Adrian Volkov did not listen to strangers unless it mattered, unless something in my voice cut through the noise he was used to controlling. And for one suspended second, everything slowed, the quiet stretched thin, fragile, like glass about to crack, and I saw it clearly now. The man to his right shifting his chair by less than an inch, his hand disappearing below the table where no one else could see. Except I had already seen too much, and my breath caught in my throat as the tension snapped, not with sound, but with movement, fast and deliberate, the kind that did not belong in a room built on polite conversations and expensive wine. And then everything changed without ever crossing into chaos, because chaos would have been loud, messy, uncontrolled, and this was none of those things. This was precise, contained, like a storm that knew exactly where to land. And Adrian moved, not because he panicked, but because he chose to, his body shifting just enough to avoid the unseen danger I had sensed a heartbeat earlier, his chair scraping softly against the floor, a subtle sound that somehow carried more weight than any raised voice. And suddenly the room was not quiet anymore, not in the same way. The silence had turned sharp, filled with awareness, with consequences, with the understanding that something had almost happened and everyone in that room knew it, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. And I stood frozen beside him, my tray still in my hands, my fingers locked so tightly around the edge that they had gone numb, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life, because the man who had shifted was no longer pretending, his posture rigid now, his eyes flicking toward Adrian with something that looked almost like calculation unraveling. And I realized this was not just tension. This was betrayal that had failed to stay hidden, and Adrian knew it. He had to know it, because the way he turned his head, slow, controlled, his gaze landing directly on the man beside him, was not the look of someone confused. It was the look of someone confirming a suspicion, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop without anyone touching the thermostat. And no one spoke, not a single word, because words would have made it real, and this world did not need words to function. It moved on glances and silence and decisions made in less than a second, and I should have left. I should have walked away the moment I felt the shift, but I could not move. Not when Adrian's attention shifted again, this time to me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my lungs forget how to work, because he was not just looking at me, he was studying me, measuring what I had done, what I had seen, and why I had chosen to act. And there was no anger in that gaze, no immediate threat, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he was thinking, and men like him thinking was never simple. And I swallowed hard, my voice gone, my heartbeat loud in my ears, as the weight of that moment pressed down on me. And then he spoke, his voice low enough that only I could hear, controlled in a way that made every word feel deliberate. Why? He asked, not demanding, not accusing. Just one single question that carried more weight than anything else in that room. And I opened my mouth, not even sure what I was going to say, because the truth was too simple for a moment like this, too human for a place that did not seem to allow it. But it came out anyway, barely above a whisper, because you did not see it. And for the first time since I had stepped into that room, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not exactly, but something quieter, something that suggested I had just changed the way this night was supposed to end. And in that instant, I understood something I could not take back. I was no longer invisible to him, and in his world, being seen was never without consequence. No one moved to stop him. And that was the most terrifying part, because whatever had just almost happened, whatever silent line had been crossed, it was now entirely in Adrian's hands to decide how it would end, and the rest of the room seemed to understand that without a single word being spoken, their stillness no longer casual but deliberate, like they were waiting for permission to breathe again. And I realized I was still standing too close, still holding the tray like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. My arms starting to ache from how tightly I gripped it, but I could not step back, not when his attention had not left me, not when those eyes were still fixed on mine like I had become the most important variable in a situation I barely understood, and I felt it then, the shift in power, subtle but undeniable, because a minute ago I was invisible, just another server moving through the room. And now I was something else entirely, something he had chosen to notice. And that meant everything had changed, and I did not know the rules of this world, did not know what being seen by someone like him truly meant, but I knew it was not something that faded with time, and I swallowed, my throat dry, forcing myself to breathe evenly even though my pulse was still racing, because showing fear felt dangerous in a way I could not explain. And then he stood, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, but smoothly, controlled, like everything he did carried intention. And the simple act of him rising shifted the entire room around him, men straightening in their seats, eyes lowering just slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and I felt my own body react before my mind could catch up, my shoulders pulling back, my posture stiffening, as if some instinct was trying to keep me steady under the weight of his presence. And he stepped closer, closing the small distance between us until I could feel the heat of him, until the space that had existed between us was gone. And I had never been this close to someone like him before, someone who carried authority so naturally it felt like gravity. And he reached out, not suddenly, not roughly, but with a precision that made the gesture feel more intentional than any force ever could, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the tray, steadying it, or maybe steadying me, I could not tell which. And the contact sent a sharp awareness through me, not fear. Exactly. But something that made my breath hitch for just a second too long. And he noticed, of course he noticed, because men like him noticed everything, and his gaze softened by the smallest fraction, not kindness, not warmth, but something more dangerous, curiosity, and his voice when he spoke again was quieter, meant only for me. You stayed, he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Like he was cataloging a fact about me that did not fit into the world he knew, and I blinked, trying to find my voice again, trying to understand why that mattered, why any of this mattered. And the answer came to me in pieces, scattered but undeniable, because I had seen something I was not meant to see, had interfered in something that did not belong to me. And now I was standing here, still too close, still under his attention, and leaving was no longer simple, and the realization settled into my chest, heavy and cold, that whatever had just started, it was not over, not even close. And then, as if confirming that thought, his hand dropped from the tray, but instead of stepping away, he leaned in just slightly, close enough that his words brushed against my ear, low and controlled. People who notice things like that, he paused, just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in, do not get ignored. And something in the way he said it made it clear this was not a warning, not entirely, but not reassurance either. It was a statement. A quiet shift in the path my life had been on just minutes ago, and I felt it then, deep in my bones, the undeniable truth that I had crossed into his world, and there was no clean way back out. The room did not return to normal, not really. It only pretended to. Conversations resumed in low voices, glasses were lifted again, chairs shifted slightly, but beneath it all there was a new awareness, something sharp and watchful that had not been there before, and I could feel it pressing against my skin, reminding me that I was still standing in the center of something I did not belong to. And for a brief moment I thought that was it, that he would step away, that whatever had passed between us would dissolve into the background like everything else in this place. But Adrian did not move back. He did not release me from his presence. Instead, he straightened just enough to look at the rest of the table, his expression returning to that controlled neutrality that seemed to define him. And it was like watching a switch flip, because whatever curiosity had flickered in his eyes a second ago was now hidden again, locked behind something colder, something far more calculating. And when he spoke this time, his voice carried just enough to reach the others, smooth and even, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. We will continue, he said, and it was not a suggestion. It was a command wrapped in calm, and the men around the table responded without hesitation, adjusting themselves, picking up threads of conversation that had been cut mid-sentence. But I could see it now, the difference, the way one man avoided direct eye contact, the way another held his glass, just a little too tightly, and I realized that whatever had almost happened had not been erased. It had simply been postponed, and that made everything more dangerous in a way I could not fully explain, because tension that lingers is never harmless. And I shifted my weight slightly, finally remembering that I was supposed to leave, that I had a role to play. One that did not involve standing beside a man like him any longer than necessary. So I lowered the tray carefully onto the table, my movements deliberate, controlled, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, even though nothing about this moment felt normal anymore. And I took a small step back, then another, my heart still racing but my expression carefully neutral, because I had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant pretending everything was fine, even when it was not. And for a second, I thought I might actually make it out, that I could disappear back into the rhythm of the restaurant, into the noise and movement that felt safe compared to this. But then his voice stopped me, not loud, not sharp, just my name, spoken with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. Lily. And I froze, because I had never told him my name, and the realization hit me like a quiet shock, settling deep in my chest, because it meant he already knew, or had found out in the seconds between everything else. And slowly, I turned back, meeting his gaze again, unable to do anything else, and there it was again. That focus, that attention that made everything else fade into the background. And he stepped closer once more, not caring that the room could see, not caring about anything except the conversation that now existed between us. And when he spoke, his voice dropped again, meant only for me. You are leaving too quickly, he said, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a statement that felt heavier than it should have, because it carried expectation, and I hesitated, my instincts pulling me in two directions at once, one telling me to leave while I still could, the other reminding me that walking away might not be an option anymore, not after everything that had just happened. And I forced a small breath, steadying myself before answering, keeping my voice even despite the tension building inside me. I have a job to do, I said quietly, because it was the only truth I could offer without stepping further into something I did not understand. And for a moment, he simply watched me, his eyes searching mine as if weighing something invisible, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to unsettle me more than if he had remained completely unreadable, and he nodded once, as if accepting my answer while also deciding something else entirely, something I was not yet aware of, and he stepped aside, just enough to clear the path, but not enough to release the tension that had formed between us. And as I moved past him, every step felt heavier than the last, because I could feel it, the invisible thread that had formed in that room, something binding this moment to whatever came next, and I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that this was not over, that walking away now did not mean escaping. It only meant delaying whatever came after, and somewhere behind me, his voice carried again, calm, controlled, but impossible to ignore. We will speak again. And I did not turn back. I could not, because I already understood the truth in those words. In his world, nothing happened by accident, and I had just become part of something that would not let me go. I should have felt relief the moment I stepped out of that room. The moment the heavy doors closed behind me and the air shifted back into something normal, something familiar, but I did not, because the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud against the polished floor, each step echoing like a reminder that I had not really left anything behind, that whatever had started in there had followed me out. And I tried to focus on the routine, on the things I understood, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations from the main dining area, the steady rhythm of a place that ran on predictable patterns. But my hands were still unsteady as I set the tray down at the service station, my fingers lingering on the edge like I needed to convince myself it was real, that I was still just a waitress, still just Lily Carter who worked double shifts and counted tips at the end of the night. But that felt thinner now, like a version of myself that no longer fit quite right, and I exhaled. Slowly, trying to steady my breathing, trying to push everything that had just happened into a corner of my mind where I could deal with it later, because right now I needed to keep moving, needed to blend back into the flow before anyone noticed something was off. But of course someone did, because Megan was already watching me from across the station, her brow furrowed, her arms crossed as she leaned against the counter, and the moment I met her eyes, she pushed off and walked over, her voice low but sharp with concern. "What happened in there?" she asked, not even pretending it was casual, and I shook my head instinctively, reaching for a stack of clean glasses just to give my hands something to do. "Nothing," I said, too quickly, too automatically, and she narrowed her eyes, clearly not buying it, because Megan had worked here long enough to know when something was not right. "That did not look like nothing," she pressed, glancing toward the VIP doors like she expected them to open at any second, and I hesitated, just for a moment, because how was I supposed to explain something I barely understood myself? How was I supposed to put into words the feeling of standing too close to something dangerous and knowing it had noticed me? So I settled for the simplest truth I could manage. "It was tense," I said quietly, keeping my voice even, controlled, even though my pulse had not fully settled, and she studied me for a second longer before letting out a slow breath, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more cautious. "That table is not just tense," she said, lowering her voice further. "Those men do not come here for casual dinners." And something in the way she said it made my stomach tighten, because it confirmed what I had already felt, what I had already started to understand, that this was not just another night, not just another shift, and I nodded slightly, pretending that was all there was to it, that I could file it away and move on. But before I could say anything else, before I could convince either of us that this was over, the door behind us opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make the air shift again, and I did not have to turn around to know who it was. I felt it before I saw it, that same quiet gravity, that same awareness that seemed to bend everything around it. And Megan noticed it too, her posture straightening, her expression tightening just slightly as she stepped back, giving space without being told, and I turned slowly, my heartbeat picking up again despite myself. And there he was, Adrian Volkov, standing just inside the service area, like he belonged there as much as anywhere else, his presence just as controlled, just as deliberate, his eyes finding mine immediately like there was no one else worth noticing, and for a second, no one spoke. Not me, not Megan, not even the kitchen staff who suddenly seemed very interested in anything but this. And he stepped forward, closing the distance with the same calm certainty that made it impossible to ignore him. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, meant only for me even though we were not alone. "We are not finished," he said. And it was not a threat, not exactly. But it was not a question either. It was something else entirely, something final in a way that made my chest tighten, and I realized then that leaving that room had not been an exit. It had only been an intermission, and whatever came next was already waiting for me. For a moment, I could not move, Not because I did not want to, but because something in the way he stood there made movement feel like a decision I did not fully control anymore. And the space around us shifted again, quieter this time, heavier, as if the entire restaurant had instinctively stepped back from whatever was unfolding between us, and I became painfully aware of Megan standing just a few feet away, her silence louder than anything she could have said, because she was watching, trying to understand, trying to decide if she should step in or stay out of it. And I knew she would stay out of it, not because she did not care, but because something about Adrian made interference feel like the wrong choice, even to someone who did not know him. And I forced myself to breathe, steady and slow, grounding myself in something familiar, something I could still control, and I met his gaze again, refusing to look away even though every instinct told me that would be easier, safer. I have work to do, I said quietly, repeating the only boundary I had left, because it was true, because it was simple, and because it was the only thing that still belonged to me in this moment. And for a second, nothing changed. His expression did not shift, his posture did not soften, but there was a pause, a small, almost invisible space where he seemed to consider my words, not dismissing them, not accepting them either, just weighing them like everything else. And then he took another step closer, not enough to invade, but enough to remind me that distance between us was no longer accidental. And his voice dropped slightly, controlled but edged with something new, something that felt less like curiosity and more like intention. "So do I," he said, and the words should have been ordinary, but they were not, because of the way he said them, because of the way his eyes did not leave mine, because of the way the room seemed to hold its breath again. And I realized he was not just here to talk. He was here to decide something that involved me whether I wanted it to or not. And my grip tightened slightly on the counter behind me, grounding myself, reminding myself that I was still standing, still thinking, still able to choose how I responded. Even if the options felt narrower than they had a few minutes ago, "Then maybe you should go back to your table," I said, my voice steady despite the tension building under my skin, because if I gave in now, even a little, I had a feeling I would not get that ground back. And for the first time, there was a flicker of something unmistakable in his expression, not irritation, not anger, but recognition, like he had just realized I was not going to fold as easily as he might have expected. And instead of pushing, instead of closing the space further, he stopped, his gaze sharpening slightly as if reassessing me entirely, and the silence stretched again. But this time it felt different, less like a standoff and more like a shift, like something had just changed direction. And then, unexpectedly, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a move in a game neither of us had agreed to play, and he stepped back, creating space where there had been none, but the tension did not disappear. It simply changed shape, settling into something quieter, something that felt like it would last longer than this moment. And he glanced briefly toward the main dining area before looking back at me, his voice low but carrying a certainty that made it impossible to ignore. "Finish your shift," he said. And there it was again, not a request, not an order exactly, but something in between, something that assumed compliance without demanding it outright. And I hesitated, because part of me wanted to argue, wanted to push back just to prove that I could. But another part of me understood that this was not about control in the way I was used to. It was something else, something more layered. And before I could respond, before I could decide what to say, he turned slightly, already stepping away as if the conversation was not over, just paused, and over his shoulder, without looking back, he added, "I will be waiting." And the words settled into the air between us, quiet but heavy, and I stood there for a second longer, the meaning sinking in, because this was not something I could ignore, not something I could walk away from by pretending it had not happened. And as the door to the main dining room closed behind him, I realized that whatever control I thought I had reclaimed had been temporary at best, because now there was a next step, and whether I liked it or not, he had already decided I would take it. I tried to go back to normal. I really did. I picked up another tray, took another order, forced my hands to move with the same rhythm I had practiced for years, but nothing felt the same anymore. Every sound sharper, every glance heavier, like the entire restaurant had shifted slightly out of alignment, and I was the only one who could feel it. And no matter how much I focused on the routine, my mind kept circling back to his words, to the way he said them like the outcome had already been decided. And I hated that. Hated the quiet certainty in his voice that suggested I would follow through, because I had spent my entire life making my own choices, even when they were difficult, even when they were the only thing I had left, and I was not about to let that slip away now, not because of him, not because of anyone. But the problem was that every time I told myself that, I remembered the look in his eyes, the way he had watched me like I was something unexpected, something he had not planned for. And that thought alone made it harder to dismiss him as just another powerful man who thought he could control everything around him. Because there had been something else there, something quieter, something that did not fit the image I had built in my head, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I did not fully understand him. And not understanding someone like that felt like a risk I could not measure. Lily, Megan's voice cut through my thoughts, low and urgent, and I turned to find her standing closer than I realized. Her expression serious now, no trace of curiosity left, only concern. "You are not going back there," she said firmly, glancing toward the VIP section as if expecting him to appear again at any second. And I hesitated, because part of me wanted to agree immediately. Wanted to let her pull me out of this before it went any further, but another part of me knew it was not that simple. Knew that ignoring him was not the same as being free of him. And I shook my head slightly, my voice quieter than I intended. "I do not think I have a choice," I admitted, and the words felt heavier once they were out, more real, more final, and Megan frowned, her arms crossing again as she studied me. "You always have a choice," she said, but there was less certainty in her voice now, like even she was starting to question that belief. And I wished she was right, I really did, but the truth was already settling in my chest, steady and undeniable. Because this was not about a simple decision anymore. It was about consequences I did not fully understand. And before either of us could say anything else, the manager's voice called out from across the floor, sharp and impatient, reminding us both that the night was still moving, that customers were still waiting, and I took that as my cue to step away. To move before I had time to overthink it, because standing still felt worse somehow. Like it would trap me in this moment longer than I could handle. And the next hour passed in a blur, orders taken, plates delivered, smiles given where they were expected, but underneath it all there was a tension that never fully left, a quiet awareness that time was running out, that the end of my shift was getting closer with every passing minute. And when it finally came, when the clock ticked past midnight and the last table began to clear, I felt it again, that pull, that invisible thread, tightening just slightly, reminding me that something was waiting on the other side of this. And I stood in the locker room for a moment longer than necessary, my uniform folded neatly in my hands, my reflection staring back at me in the mirror like I was trying to recognize someone I used to be, someone who had walked into this night without knowing it would change anything. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself before reaching for my coat, because whatever happened next, I needed to face it on my terms, or at least convince myself that I still could. And when I stepped back into the quiet hallway leading out of the restaurant, I knew before I even saw him, because the air shifted again, that same quiet gravity settling into place, and there he was, exactly where he said he would be, waiting, like this had never been a question, like it had only ever been a matter of time. I should have turned around. I should have pretended I did not see him and walked straight out into the night like none of this had ever happened. But my feet stopped the second I caught sight of him leaning against the wall at the end of the hallway, hands relaxed at his sides, posture effortless in a way that made waiting look like control instead of patience. And for a moment neither of us moved, the distance between us stretching just enough to feel deliberate, like he was giving me space to make a choice he already knew the answer to. And I exhaled slowly, the sound louder in the quiet hallway than I expected, my fingers tightening slightly around the strap of my bag as I forced myself to step forward, one step, then another, each one heavier than it should have been, because walking toward him felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. And yet I did it anyway, stopping a few feet away, close enough to feel that same pull, that same quiet intensity that had followed him all night. And for a second, I did not say anything, because I did not know where to start. Did not know how to take everything that had happened and turn it into something simple enough to speak out loud. But he did not seem in a rush to fill the silence, his eyes steady on mine, watching, waiting, like he was giving me the chance to speak first, even though we both knew he did not need me to. And I lifted my chin slightly, grounding myself in the only thing I still had control over, my voice. You said you wanted to talk, I said, keeping it even, neutral, even though my pulse had started to climb again. And he nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he had been expecting exactly that. I did, he replied, his voice low but clear in the empty space. And then he pushed himself off the wall, closing the distance between us just enough to shift the dynamic again. Not crowding me, not forcing anything, but making it impossible to pretend this was casual. And I felt it immediately, the change in the air, the way everything seemed to narrow down to just this moment, just this conversation, and I held my ground, refusing to step back even though instinct told me it would be easier, safer, and for a second, something like approval flickered in his expression, subtle but there, and then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled focus. You saw something tonight, he said, not as a question, not asking for confirmation, just stating a fact that did not need to be proven, and I hesitated, not because I wanted to deny it, but because I understood now that every word mattered, that this was not a conversation where I could afford to be careless, and I chose my response carefully. I noticed something. I corrected quietly, because there was a difference, because I was not claiming to understand his world, only acknowledging what I had seen, and his gaze sharpened slightly, as if he appreciated the distinction, as if that small choice of words told him more than anything else could have, and he took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to mark the shift in the conversation. Most people would have walked away, he said, and there was something in his tone now, something quieter, something that felt less like an evaluation and more like a genuine observation, and I shrugged slightly, even though the movement felt too small against the weight of the moment. Maybe I am not most people, I replied, and the words came out steadier than I expected, more certain, and for a second, something changed in his expression again, something that looked almost like interest, but deeper, more focused, like I had just confirmed something he had already started to suspect, and the silence stretched between us once more, but this time it did not feel as heavy, it felt different, like something had shifted into place. Something neither of us had planned, but both of us recognized. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, closer. That is exactly the problem, he said, and the way he said it made my breath catch, not because it sounded like a warning, but because it did not, because it sounded like something else entirely, something that meant this was not about what had happened in that room anymore. It was about what came after, and I realized then that this conversation was not an ending, it was a beginning, one I had already stepped into without realizing it. And standing there in that quiet hallway, with the city waiting just beyond the doors, I understood something I could not ignore. I had not just saved him tonight, I had changed something, and now he was not going to let that go. The word problem lingered in the air between us longer than it should have, settling into something heavier than a warning and quieter than a threat, and I felt it in the way my chest tightened slightly, in the way my instincts sharpened instead of pulling back, because somewhere in that single word was a truth I could not ignore. This was not just about what I had done, it was about what that meant to him, and more importantly, what it meant in a world I did not belong to, and I crossed my arms slowly, not defensive, but grounding, creating a small barrier between us that felt necessary even if it changed nothing. Then maybe you should stay away from problems, I said, keeping my voice calm, steady, even though I knew that was not how his world worked, not really, and for a brief second, there was silence again, not tense, not fragile, but deliberate, like we were both testing something invisible. And then he exhaled softly, the sound almost inaudible, but enough to shift the moment. If I avoided problems, he said, his voice lower now, quieter, I would not be where I am. And there it was again, that controlled honesty, not an explanation, not an excuse, just a fact, and I held his gaze, refusing to let that pull me in too easily, because I could feel it now, the way conversations with him had a way of narrowing your options without ever forcing them, and I was not ready to lose that control, not yet. And where exactly is that? I asked, tilting my head slightly, because if he wanted to draw me into this, I needed to understand at least part of it, needed to hear something real instead of reading between lines I did not fully understand, and something shifted in his eyes again, not guarded, not entirely open either, but something in between, like he was deciding how much to give, how much I was allowed to know, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. That he would deflect or redirect the conversation the way men like him often did. But instead, he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to lower his voice further, making the moment feel more contained, more intentional. A place where people do not get second chances for noticing the wrong thing, he said, and the simplicity of it made my breath pause, because there was no exaggeration in his tone, no dramatics, just a quiet certainty that made it feel more real than if he had tried to make it sound dangerous. And I swallowed, the weight of that statement settling into me slowly, because it was not a threat directed at me. Not exactly. It was a description of the world he lived in, a world I had brushed against without understanding the cost. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not panic, but awareness, clearer and sharper than before. Because now I understood that this was not just about him deciding something. It was about me being part of something I had not chosen but could no longer ignore. And I took a breath, steadying myself before answering. Then why am I still here? I asked, and the question came out quieter than I expected, but stronger too, because it was the only thing that mattered now, the only piece of this that did not make sense. And his gaze held mine without hesitation, without flickering away, and for a second, something in his expression shifted again, something deeper this time, something that did not feel like calculation or control, but something else entirely, something I could not name yet, because you changed the outcome, he said simply, and the words landed harder than anything else he had said tonight, because they were not about power or control or consequence. They were about something I had done, something that had altered a moment that was supposed to go differently, and I felt it then. The truth of it settling into my chest, because he was right. I had stepped in, I had made a choice, and that choice had changed something, not just for him, but for me too, and the silence that followed felt different now, less like a standoff and more like a turning point, and I realized that whatever came next was not just about surviving this moment. It was about understanding what it meant to have already crossed that line, and then, before I could say anything else, before I could process that realization any further, he spoke again, his voice quieter, but carrying a weight that made my pulse pick up despite myself. And now I need to decide what to do with that. And for the first time, I understood exactly what he meant, because this was no longer just a conversation, it was a decision, one that involved me in ways I was only beginning to understand, and standing there in that narrow hallway, with the world outside waiting just a few feet away, I realized that whatever he chose next would change everything again. And I was not sure if I was ready for that, or if I had ever really had a choice at all. The way he said it did not leave room for misunderstanding, not in his tone, not in the steady way his eyes held mine like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever I was about to say. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the weight of it settle, because this was the part where everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, irreversible way that you only recognize after it is already happening. And I felt something shift inside me, something steadier than before. Because if this was a decision, if I was part of it whether I liked it or not, then I was not going to stand here and wait for him to define it alone. You are talking like I am something to manage, I said, my voice calm but firm, because that mattered, because how I responded right now would set the tone for everything that came after, and for a brief second, there was silence again, but this time it was different. Not a pause for control, but a pause for consideration. And he did not look away, did not dismiss it. Instead, he studied me, really studied me, like he was adjusting his understanding of me in real time. And then, slowly, something in his expression shifted, not softer, not weaker, but more precise, like he had just corrected a miscalculation. No, he said quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it was not defensive, it was not dismissive, it was deliberate. I am talking like you are. Something I cannot ignore. And the honesty in that caught me off guard more than anything else could have, because it was not wrapped in control or authority. It was simple, direct, and for a moment, I did not have a response ready, which almost never happened, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay grounded, because this was where people got pulled in, this was where they lost perspective, and I was not going to let that happen, not without understanding exactly what I was stepping into. That still does not explain what you are going to do, I said, keeping my voice steady, because that was the real question, not what I was to him, but what he intended to do about it. And for the first time since this started, he did not answer immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, like he was choosing his words carefully instead of relying on instinct. And that alone told me this mattered more than I realized. And then he moved, not closer, not away, just enough to shift his weight, grounding himself in the moment the same way I was trying to. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more contained. "I am deciding if you are a risk," he said, and the clarity of it hit harder than anything else, because there was no hidden meaning, no softer interpretation, just the truth laid out in a way that made my pulse spike despite my effort to stay calm. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, even as that realization settled in. Because fear would not help me here, hesitation would not help me here. "And what have you decided?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less steady. And for a moment, something flickered in his expression again, something that looked almost like recognition, like he had not expected me to ask that so directly. And then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled focus. But this time there was something else layered beneath it, something I had not seen before, something that felt almost like certainty forming in real time. And he took a small step closer, just enough to close the space between us again, and the air shifted with him, heavier, more defined. And when he spoke, his voice dropped just enough to make the moment feel contained, like the rest of the world had faded out completely. "If you were a risk," he said slowly, each word measured, "you would not be standing here having this conversation." And the meaning of that settled into me instantly, clear and undeniable. Because he was not just answering the question, he was redefining it, shifting the entire dynamic in a way that made my breath catch for just a second, and I realized then that whatever decision he had been weighing, it had already been made, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the direction of everything that came next, and I felt it, that shift, that subtle but undeniable movement from uncertainty to something else entirely, and I did not know if that should make me feel relieved or more on edge, because in his world, not being a risk did not mean being free. It meant something else, something I was only beginning to understand. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Which means you are something else." And the way he said it made it clear that whatever that something else was, it mattered. And standing there in that narrow hallway, with the night waiting just beyond the door, I realized that this was no longer about whether I could walk away. It was about what I had just become in a world I never meant to enter. Something else echoed in my mind long after he said it. Not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. The way he had already moved past the question while I was still trying to understand what it meant, and I felt that shift again, deeper this time. Because this was no longer about whether I was in his world or not. It was about what place I held in it. And I did not like how undefined that felt. Did not like how easily he could stand there and decide something that affected me, without asking if I wanted any part of it. And I straightened slightly, grounding myself before I let that frustration show too clearly. Because reacting without thinking would only give him more control, and I needed to hold on to whatever balance I still had. "You keep talking like you already know what I am," I said, my voice calm but sharper now, because this mattered, because I was not going to let him define me without pushing back. And his gaze did not waver, did not soften. But there was something there now, something more attentive, like he was listening in a way that went beyond the words. And for a moment, the silence stretched again. But this time it did not feel like pressure. It felt like space, like he was giving me room to say more if I chose to. And I hesitated, because part of me wanted to stop, wanted to leave this exactly where it was. But another part of me knew that if I did not speak now, I would lose something I could not get back. "I am not part of your world," I added quietly, more measured this time, because it was the truth I needed him to hear, the boundary I needed to make clear. And for a second, something in his expression shifted again, not disagreement, not dismissal, but something harder to read, like he was considering that statement not as a fact, but as a variable, something that could change depending on what came next. And that realization made my chest tighten slightly, because it meant he did not see this as fixed. He saw it as something that could be altered, and before I could respond to that, before I could push back further, he stepped closer again, not enough to crowd me, but enough to narrow the space between us in a way that made everything else fade out. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Like every word carried weight, he was choosing carefully. "You were not," he said, and the correction landed harder than I expected, because it was not loud, not forceful, but it shifted everything in a way I could not ignore. And I felt my breath catch for just a second, because that one word changed the meaning of everything that came after, and I held his gaze, refusing to let that pull me off balance completely, even as I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me. "And now," he continued, not breaking eye contact, not giving me a chance to interrupt, "you have seen too much to pretend otherwise." And there it was. The line drawn clearly, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a reality he expected me to accept, and I felt it settle into me slowly, the weight of that statement, because he was right in a way I did not want to admit. I had seen something. I had stepped into a moment that was not meant for me, and there was no clean way to erase that, no simple way to walk back to who I was before this night started. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the mix of emotions building under the surface, because this was where people panicked. This was where they lost control, and I was not going to do that. Not here, not in front of him. Seeing something does not mean I belong to it. I replied, my voice quieter now, but no less firm, because I needed to hold on to that, needed to remind both of us that I still had a say in what this meant. And for a moment, he simply looked at me, really looked, like he was weighing not just my words, but the intention behind them. And then something shifted again, something deeper this time. Something that felt less like calculation and more like decision. And he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging that I had drawn a line of my own. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "No," he said, and that single word carried a finality that made my pulse pick up despite myself. "But it means it will not let you go." And the way he said it made it clear that he was not talking about himself, not entirely. He was talking about something bigger, something that existed beyond this hallway, beyond this conversation, something that had already started to move the moment I stepped into that room earlier tonight, and I felt it then, the truth of it settling in deeper than anything else, because this was not just about him deciding something. It was about a chain of events already in motion, one that I had become part of whether I wanted to or not. And standing there in that quiet space, with his words hanging between us, I realized that walking away was no longer about distance. It was about whether I could ever truly leave something that had already begun to close around me. And for the first time since this started, I was not sure what the answer was. His words did not fade after he said them. They settled, heavy and quiet, like something final had just been placed between us, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, letting the meaning sink in, because this was no longer about misunderstanding or misreading a situation. This was about reality, about consequences that existed whether I accepted them or not. And I felt it in the way my thoughts slowed down, in the way my instincts stopped pushing me to walk away and instead forced me to stand still and think, really think, about what came next. Because for the first time since this started, I understood that leaving right now would not solve anything. It would not undo what I had seen. It would not erase the fact that I had stepped into something I was not meant to. And that realization grounded me in a way nothing else had. Because if I could not undo it, then I had to face it. And I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze again, not with defiance this time, not with resistance, but with something steadier, something more deliberate. "Then stop talking like I am the problem," I said quietly, and the words felt different coming out, less reactive, more controlled, because I was not arguing anymore. I was setting terms, and for a moment, he did not respond, his eyes holding mine with that same intensity. But there was something else there now, something more measured, like he was reassessing the entire situation from a new angle. And then he exhaled, softly, the sound almost imperceptible, but enough to shift the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, calmer. "You are not the problem," he said, and the certainty in his tone made my breath pause, because it was the first time he had drawn that distinction clearly, the first time he had separated me from whatever else was happening around us. And that mattered more than I expected it to, because it changed the way I saw this, changed the way I saw him, even if only slightly. And I held on to that shift, that small piece of clarity, because it gave me something to work with, something to respond to that was not just assumption or implication. Then what is? I asked, and my voice was quieter now, but more focused, because if I was going to be part of this conversation, then I needed answers, not just statements that left everything open-ended. And for a second, something in his expression shifted again, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but something more deliberate. Like he was deciding how much to give me, how far to let me see into a world that had never been meant for me. And then he stepped slightly to the side, not away, but enough to open the space between us, enough to break the intensity just a fraction, and his gaze moved briefly toward the door at the end of the hallway, toward the city beyond it, before returning to me. What you saw tonight was not random, he said, his voice steady, controlled. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not just an explanation. It was a warning wrapped in truth, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, because I had already started to understand that, already felt the weight of it in the way the room had shifted, in the way people had moved without speaking. And he continued before I could respond, his tone even, but carrying something deeper now, something that felt closer to honesty than anything else he had said so far. And it does not end. Because you walk away. And there it was again, that same reality, that same quiet certainty that made it impossible to pretend this was something simple. And I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, because I understood that now. I really did, and the silence that followed felt different again, less tense, less uncertain, like we had moved past something without even realizing it. And I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself in that new understanding. Because if this was not about walking away, then it was about what came next, about what I was supposed to do with the fact that I was already part of something I could not undo. And I met his gaze again, steadier now, more certain. Then tell me what that means for me, I said, and there was no hesitation in my voice this time, no uncertainty, because I was done reacting, done letting him lead the conversation entirely. And for a moment, he simply looked at me, really looked like he was seeing something new, something he had not expected to find. And then, slowly, something shifted in his expression again, something deeper this time, something that felt like a decision settling into place. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but carried a weight that made my pulse pick up despite myself. It means you do not leave alone tonight. And the words landed between us with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. And I felt it instantly. That shift from conversation to action, from uncertainty to something defined, and standing there in that quiet hallway, I realized that whatever line I had crossed earlier tonight had just moved again, and this time, there was no pretending it was accidental. The words settled between us like something inevitable, not rushed, not forced, just placed there with a certainty that made it impossible to ignore. And for a moment I did not respond, not because I did not understand, but because I did, too clearly. And that clarity made everything feel heavier than before, because this was no longer about possibility, it was about direction, about something already in motion that neither of us was pretending could be stopped. And I let out a slow breath, steadying myself, feeling the weight of the decision pressing in from all sides, because part of me wanted to push back, wanted to argue that I could walk out that door alone and leave all of this behind. But the rest of me knew better now, knew that this was not about what I wanted to believe. It was about what was real, and what was real had already started the moment I stepped into that room earlier tonight, and I met his gaze again, holding it, not with defiance, not with resistance, but with something steadier, something that came from understanding instead of reaction. And if I say no, I asked quietly, because I needed to hear it, needed to understand the edges of this choice even if they were not what I wanted them to be. And for a second, there was silence again, but it did not feel tense. It felt measured, like he had expected the question and was deciding how to answer it in a way that did not insult me. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but there was something else in it now, something quieter, something that felt closer to truth than authority. Then I still make sure you get home safely, he said. And the answer caught me off guard, not because of what it implied, but because of what it did not. There was no threat in it, no hidden consequence, just a statement that felt grounded in something I could not fully name yet. And I studied him for a second longer, searching for the angle, for the part of this that gave him control. But all I found was that same steady focus, that same certainty that had been there all night. and I realized then that this was not about forcing me into anything. It was about ensuring an outcome he had already decided mattered, and that shifted something inside me, something small but significant, because it meant I was not just being moved like a piece on a board, I was being considered, even if I did not fully understand why, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, because the truth was already settling in. I was not walking away from this tonight, not completely, and pretending otherwise would only make things harder, and without another word, I stepped past him, not waiting for permission, not asking for direction, just moving forward because standing still felt like surrender, and for a second, I thought he might stop me, might redirect me or correct me, but he did not. Instead, I heard his footsteps fall in beside mine, steady, unhurried, matching my pace without overtaking it. And that alone told me more than anything else could have, because it meant he was not leading. Not yet. He was simply there, and we moved through the hallway together, the distance between us small but deliberate, like an understanding had formed without needing to be spoken out loud. And when we reached the door, I pushed it open, stepping out into the cool night air, the city stretching out in front of us with its lights and noise and movement, so normal compared to everything that had just happened. And I paused for a second on the sidewalk, letting the air fill my lungs, grounding myself in something real again, something familiar, but even that felt different now, like I was seeing it from a new angle, one I had not asked for but could not ignore, and I glanced at him briefly, just enough to confirm he was still there, still watching, still present in a way that felt impossible to dismiss. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that had been building since the moment I told him not to move. And I realized then that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had not planned for, something I did not fully understand, but something I had already stepped into without realizing it. And as we started walking, side by side into a night that no longer felt as simple as it had a few hours ago, one thought settled clearly in my mind, steady and undeniable. I had saved him once, but whatever came next, I had a feeling he was not going to let me walk away without becoming part of his story.